You can get Sons of Patriarchy completely ad-free on Apple Podcasts for $4.99 per month or $44.99 per year. This applies to our entire back catalog and every upcoming episode completely ad-free. Listening without interruption. If you don't mind the ads, you can still listen to the series for free on any of your favorite podcast platforms. This revenue helps support Outreach Idaho and helps pay the bills of the series. Now, on to the episode. Quick announcement before we start this episode. We've launched our website and initial line of merch. Go to sonsofpatriarchy.com and pick up a t-shirt, a sticker, or a crew neck fleece, or all three. And wait till you see our design. We went bold. A link to the website is in our show notes, or simply type sonsofpatriarchy.com into your search bar. Now, on with today's conversation. All right, so we got another professor. I call them all subject matter experts, SMEs, who are coming on to talk about Christian theology, political engagement, theonomy, reconstruction, whatever it may be, the first half of the series. So we got another one coming on. If you can introduce yourself, the institution that you're part of, and then after that, how you became aware of Doug Wilson or Doug Wilson affiliated movements.
My name is Vincent Baker. I teach theology at Wheaton College. I'm in my 25th year as a professor. I also direct our Center for Applied Christian Ethics. I think the first time I heard about Doug Wilson was, I may have heard about him actually when I was in seminary, but didn't know. It didn't register anything besides, oh, there's this guy named Doug Wilson, and he's just one of the names you see in some conversation about something. I think I became more aware of him when I was learning that there was New St. Andrews and those places, and there was some kind of critique that they were making of Christian colleges. So something like maybe he wrote something for Christianity Today or something like that. Then I started hearing about the things about books on slavery, things related to race that were not exactly exciting. And I remember, it's interesting because then on the other hand, there was him doing this kind of debate thing with Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah.
Right. So then he's like, hey, okay, so he's like, on my team, right? I mean, so then there was like that piece, like, okay, well, so you got this guy who's debating him. And then it's like, okay, so how should I think about that? And then obviously there's always, I would say the different ways that people have engaged with him, for or against him in TGC spaces. And I'd say in the midst of all that, at some point I'm hearing that, a kind of post-millennialist, a pastor, but also the person's kind of running this sort of institutional world of what's happening in Moscow. At some point, I mean, Peter Leithart wasn't living in Moscow anymore when I first met Peter.
Okay.
I know Peter pretty well, right? So
Okay.
we always chat up when we're at like AAR and stuff like that. But obviously, there's like this relationship they have. And then of course at some point hearing about obviously the stories about abuse in the last decade, I've heard that. Mm-hmm. And then just a kind of him being at the head of one constellation of what people would call Theo Bros, right? Because there's lots of different constellations.
Yeah, true. There are.
And so and him being one of those people. So anyway, those are among the ways that I've heard about him.
Gotcha. All right. So
a mild way to put it is to say a person not without controversy.
It's right. A person both not without controversy and likes making his controversies known and adding to them,
Yeah, yeah,
as we talk about. So
yeah.
yeah, that's it's a good introduction, and then more into your work on political theology, systematic
Hmm.
theology.
Hmm.
How did you get into this? What was Vincent's foray into political theology, public engagement,
Yeah.
Christians in public square, that stuff?
So when I was at college, I was involved with the parachurch group, the Navigators, absolutely life changing for me. And but I was also the guy that was, so this is the 80s. Okay, so let me point this out.
Okay.
So everybody watching, the 80s were a thing. But um I was uh I was the guy in our Bible study that was the guy that was into to metal. Okay. So I
Okay.
was definitely in my metal phase at that point. Not that the metal phase is like gone, but
No, middle
but
face is never gone.
right, but it was active, and Iron Maiden was probably the central band for me at that point. Um, Now you might imagine that this was not exactly a popular form of music with other people in in my universe in terms of people talking about spiritual matters.
Yeah.
And the thing was that I had an intuition that you could appreciate things without having to agree with the lifestyles of people
Yeah.
or even agree with the lyrics, maybe even or something where you like the tune but you don't like what they're saying in the tune. And but I couldn't make any kind of theological argument out of that. And I would say that was, I mean, so that was sort of like the first theology and culture type of thing. But what also that kind of grew into, I'd say, over the next 5, 6 years was thinking about big picture how Christians should be involved in the world writ large. So culture, politics, all those types of things, the world outside the church. And in the late 80s, particularly, I began thinking about that and thinking about, all right, how does one talk about, first of all, why is it okay? Because depending upon the world you're a part of, you can have people that are really saying, stay out, don't be too worldly. Or you could have people say, well, we should do it, but don't do it too much. And then other people that say that it's proper for us to think about some form of like Christianizing or something. Certainly by the late
Mhm.
80s, I was also familiar with the fact that there were differing ways that people were talking about those things. I remember hearing about something called Christian Reconstruction, which was
Mhm.
or theonomy, but it was also part of hearing about those people in contrast to dispensationalists.
Mhm.
In fact, I remember thinking that basically the only thing that it seemed like, I now know the world's much bigger than this, but at the time, it's like, well, all right, so if you have these dispensationalists talking about eschatology in a certain way, and probably certain ways that public engagement will cash out if there's any public engagement at all, versus some covenant theology people, some of them who are not just covenant theology people, but they're post-millennialists, and they're also thinking about that we ought to be involved, and hearing kind of the ways that those people would go at each other. That was when I kind of became aware of some of those things. Now, in the midst of all that, at some point, I encountered Francis Schaeffer. By the time I get to seminary, at some point, that's when I really wind up encountering Abraham Kuyper. And it's Kuyper for me that winds up being the person that gave a gift I wanted and the gift that was good to have, but I wasn't looking for.
Mhm.
The gift that I wanted was somebody giving me theological language for public engagement. The gift I wasn't looking for was the gift of critical thinking when I found out he was a racist. And
Yep,
so
true.
so that this was difficult, especially
Yeah.
when it was I was so excited about thinking about, in fact, I was just telling a class of mine about it. It's like I was ready to just sign the papers. Where
Mhm.
you lead, I will follow. I didn't know that basically what I was doing was something that I think people often do with certain figures. Some figure turns the lights on for you in a certain way,
Mhm.
and you think that this person will turn the lights on for you in every way. And you might begin to think, I want to read everything about them. I want to read everything that they've said about whatever. And you don't recognize that you might be putting a halo around that person's head. And when you do that, you're basically setting yourself up when you discover that they too actually are a companion with you along the life of faith rather than somebody that is a little messiah. and so I had to face that with Kuiper. And Kuiper, of course, it remains very important. For me, it's out of view of the screen here, but his picture is right here.
Hmm.
So if it was within reach, I would just grab it and say, here he is. But
If this were a video podcast, people could see this.
yeah,
But
yeah,
alas, this is audio, so they're just gonna have to imagine
yeah,
what Kuiper
yeah,
looks like.
yeah. Look him up. He's he had a large head, but he did. I mean, but that large head contained the brain of a genius for sure.
Yeah. He also had some
Uh,
funny kind of activities that he did in his room.
well, yes, there's that too. I mean, he was great and greatly flawed. So,
Yep.
and um, I think a person that was probably greatly gifted, but he knew he was greatly gifted and thus was
Mm.
intoxicated by his gifts. And then I think he's among the examples of people where you think about how they were unable to transcend the potency of what they had.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I'm not saying that he never did anything nice to people. He wasn't. I mean, he did a lot of helpful things. It's just that I think he could have been more helpful if he could get over himself.
Mhm.
And I don't think that he was ever really able to do that.
Hmm.
So for me, he's though very formative for how I think about um, why Christians should be involved in public life, because I was looking for theological permission was the biggest thing I was looking for. And then once you have permission, then you think about, all right, what now that you're in the game, what do you do?
Yeah.
That's a long answer to your question.
No, that's a perfect answer. And the reason why I say that is we were talking about this before recording, and even last time we were talking. Um, what you had just said about the light bulb going off and then us following that person kind of wherever they go,
Yeah.
I think that happens a lot in these spaces, theonomist spaces or theobro spaces or reconstruction spaces or Kuyperian, like whatever
I think
kind of
I think it
spin.
happens everywhere.
Yeah.
Because and part of it I think is because often people are educated and figures are presented to you. The figures are presented to you as, hey, these are the good people, and we're going to read about and maybe read something from the bad people, but they're the bad people. So there's
Yeah.
angels and there's devils. And then, if you actually read more than what you encountered in the class, you might find out that you like a lot of stuff with the angels. But then one day you might discover that the devil person actually had something interesting or helpful to say, that they weren't 100% wacky.
Yeah.
And so then that becomes a problem. Or like I found out with Kuiper, the person that turns the light on, you wish they turned the light off about certain things.
Exactly. Yep.
And so then what do you do when you can't live in that binary?
Hmm.
And so what we have to do, of course, is understand that these people are there. Again, I said companions with us. They're great companions. There's reasons why their stuff continues to be read. None of that means that they're Messiah. And I think we often mistake greatness for somehow they're above us. And because they're above us, it's like they didn't need Jesus as much as we did. Oh no, you will discover that they did.
Mm-hmm.
And so yesterday, actually, what I did in my class was I talked about Kuiper and race. Then I talked about Bart and Charlotte von Kirschbaum. That was
Yep.
people. They
I'm
really have
aware of
this
it. Yeah.
problem.
I don't think many are aware of it, but I went to seminary where this is talked about. Yeah.
If people look it up, just basically Karl Barth was basically in a love triangle. Let's put it that way. It was right, and look,
It was.
she's buried in the vault with him and his wife Nellie. So I
Yeah.
mean,
That's a weird situation that
yes,
happened.
exactly. But what I tell people is, you can ask whether in some of his theologizing he's trying to accommodate that relationship. But the fact that you ask that question doesn't mean the answer is yes. And so I want students to say, no, you got to go do the work and see whether that's the case. And maybe you'll find something, but you might not. And then on the flip side, it's someone like John Howard Yoder, who I did not talk about last time. So a Mennonite, right? Then there's, he died, what, 1998 or something. But what kind of came out, what some people had known, but what became publicly known was how he had these you know, numerous unwanted advances to women.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a person who's known for being an Anabaptist, sort of associated with the theology of nonviolence, all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Right. And so here's the thing, though. I don't think you can find, if you're reading most of Yoder, or maybe all of Yoder, anything that would tell you anything about what happened. My point being is that you can't always connect with somebody's writing to whatever their dysfunctions are. And so sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So, so I think it's important for us to figure out how to, even if you don't like somebody, at least ask, why is this person so influential? So somebody says, I'll never read Yoder. It's like, okay, that's fine. But if you read Stanley Hauerwas, guess what? You don't get the Stanley you're reading without John Howard Yoder.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be able to find ways to deal with complexity while being able to name, things that are often horrific.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, of course, people don't want to do that. I mean, people want the messianizing fantasy is what I will call it.
Yeah. They want black and white. They want, just tell me what's
Yes.
true. And
Yeah.
this person tells me what's
Yeah.
true and he tells me
Yeah.
what's false. And that's easy.
Yeah.
That's an easy framework to live in.
Yeah. The problem is that it's like, yeah, but that your own life doesn't cash out that way. And so why do you expect that person, and especially, by the way, if you're not a Wesleyan in your theology, why are you expecting that person to be like a person that actually was a Presbyterian or something, but in their sanctification, they did have this entire sanctification thing that John Wesley was talking about. So they're perfect in love for God, right? Will not willfully sin. That's this person. It's like your theology doesn't even tell you that. So, but people want to imagine that about these figures. And at some point, what that is doing is setting people up for tremendous disappointment. I mean, no human, aside from Jesus, who's God become flesh and identifies with us as a human, mm-hmm. No one can bear the messianic weight.
No.
Right. And so, but people place it on them. So.
Yep. Yeah. So, I also talked about this, and so I want to dig into this. This gets into public theology or political theology, where we assume like there are certain options on tap. You have the theonomist option, you have the Christian nationalist option, you have the two kingdom option, you have the Kuyperian option. So we assume, okay, which one am I going to follow along?
Yeah.
And then that's going to give me the answers I need to engage in public.
Yeah.
Is it as simple as I need this framework to help me engage publicly as a Christian in a way that is most theologically informed?
I think if people are going to be honest, what you have to recognize, I think, with any kind of figure or any kind of tradition, is that really Kuyperianism, Augustinianism, theonomy, and Anabaptistic, I mean, whatever people are doing, these are all theological experiments because none of us see clearly enough. And even with that consensus, especially if you're a Protestant, that consensus is always subject to revision. So you're trying something out. But then on top of that, you're trying it out in times and places that often, if there are certain figures that are important to you, your time and place is not like the time and place of when that person wrote it.
Amen. Yeah. So you say we can't follow John Calvin to the T because he was in 16th century Geneva and we're in 21st century America.
Well, that's right. We're not in Luther's, Germany. I mean,
we're not in Kuyper's Netherlands. We're not nowhere.
No, we're not. We're not. And which doesn't mean we can't learn from them. We can learn tons from them. But again, also, I think what people are failing to do in that point is they're not recognizing that, again, we are companions with the people that are the greats. and we can learn from them, but we don't check our own reflection at the door. We
Yeah.
don't check our own theologizing at the door. We have to do our work of thinking about, all right, so what are some ways that this helps me now to frame things and to think about what Christian faithfulness looks like, and how much am I thinking about the relationship between being a Christian and being a Christian in public spaces, and what language do I use to talk about that? Um, how do I talk about whether or not the language of the kingdom of God should factor into the way that I'm doing this? How much do I talk about what my expectations are of Christians in those places? Because I think one simple question I sometimes wonder is, it's like, would you please tell me if you think that just because you get a person that's a Christian into public office, the fact that they're Christian in public office means that they just are competent to do the job?
Exactly. Yeah.
Nobody thinks that about, well, maybe some people do, but generally people don't think that about churches. Just
Yeah.
because someone's a Christian, you don't think, well, every Christian, yeah, you can do the job as a pastor or something. It's like, actually, maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe
More high
not.
church traditions. Yeah. Or Presbyterian circles, those that have some requirements, but
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, I think some think, yeah, we need competence in this particular thing. We need a person to be
yeah,
trained
yeah,
in this
yeah,
particular thing. But I
yeah.
think Christians sometimes like, no, we just need a Christian in public office to do Christian things in public office
But yeah,
without
yeah,
thinking they
but what
should
are
be
Christian things?
trained for public office.
But what are Christian things? That's part of the thing.
Exactly.
How do you even
Yeah.
discern what Christian things are? How are you deciding what those are? Where, I mean, because nobody was talking about nuclear war in the first century.
No.
Not the way that we think about nuclear war. I mean, so if your eschatology is a God, blows up the earth like it's a Death Star, and then
Yeah.
the new heaven, new earth. It's like, no, it's really a new one. Then your eschatology is going to cash out very differently in terms of how you're thinking about our participation now versus if you're thinking about some version of a renewed heavens and earth. And so I think we have to think about what those things are, and then still think about, okay, where am I now, and with where I am now, what are the possibilities of the world that I inhabit now? And here's where I think it's important to recognize that, and I think it's really important. Sometimes Christians will say, "Have you read First Peter?"
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you have a First Peter emphasis or First Peter lens
Yep.
to this question, okay, you have no political power.
Yeah. You're in exile.
Exactly. Um, and but you still are called to be a good citizen. You're called to love your neighbors, etc. But there's no illusions of being in any direct way formative of what is happening in terms of the socio-political realities
Yeah.
that
We're just pilgrims passing
that you
through with
inhabit.
no political
Yeah,
aspirations.
yeah, yeah. Because even if you had them, people would say, "You think we're giving you this opportunity?"
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like you're in exile. Just go back to being in exile. Just be glad that we're keeping you alive.
Yeah.
So there are people, as we are talking right now on this podcast, there are people who are living in that kind of reality in the 21st century. A lot of people, actually. Different versions of it. Some are more benign, or at least somewhat nice to you, like, say, Saudi Arabia. Because you're not in the right family. Guess what? Don't even talk about having political agency. You're a subject.
Yep.
Um, More hostile, a place like North Korea, for example. So, or China, which is, I mean, they vote, but it's clearly a dictatorship and
Yep.
surveillance state, etc. But your agency is just not going to be is not going to be very much, and you will have a First Peter kind of experience. If you're in the United States, You're not living in the world of First Peter.
Mhm.
You're living in a modern republic, but not just the fact that it's a modern republic, but a modern republic where we tell kids, one day, boys and girls, one of you might be president of the United States
That's
one
right.
day.
Yeah. I remember being told that when I was a kid.
Well, see, there we are. I got a witness. And so if someone says that, that says something about what the citizen can do in terms of being involved with contributing to what kind of social and political world you have. And that's a very rare thing in world history. And for Christians to do that, First Peter is maybe a good guide to say, hey, it's a pluralistic world. At any moment, if certain people, if the power dynamics shift, you could feel like an exile. But I think you also have to think about the fact that there are people, there are texts that will suggest to us, I mean, we could just talk cultural mandate from Genesis 1, but I've lately started to talk about it at times from Psalm 8, because Psalm 8 echoes Genesis 1, 26 to 28.
Does.
And
Yep.
and so because it does, it's not echoed as a kind of longing. It's so nice that God said this for us. And it's too bad he doesn't mean it anymore because of the fall. That's not the point about Psalm 8. The point about Psalm 8 is still a sense of wonder that God would give humans this awesome responsibility. And so this awesome responsibility remains. It's never been vetoed. It's been complicated ever since Genesis 3, but it remains. And so if it remains and you are in a republic like the United States, part of your world of possibilities includes ways of working with and managing and stewarding the world in your political environment in a way where you can be culturally formative. You can be involved in how public policy comes together. You can either run for office, you can write letters, you can go to town halls, whatever. And you can at least be a person who has a seat at the table. And so, or your opinions at the table represented by someone, however it works. And I think the important thing about that is just to recognize the context enables certain kinds of possibilities that just aren't, um, just haven't been, available for most people. So in that environment, then when people are talking about things like theonomy or two kingdoms, etc., my question is always, okay, first of all, um, how are you thinking about the fact that, one, there's certain things that Christians are obligated to do no matter whether they have power or not? So, second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. There's some kind of truth that there's horizontal responsibility we have in the world toward others. That, loving your neighbor includes seeking their good. Romans 13:10, love does no harm to a neighbor. If you're thinking about those kinds of things, how is that going to work out when you're thinking about how it works out in the domain of the political? And I think you have to be thinking about that. So if we're taking for granted already that Psalm 8 means God never said you shouldn't participate in the world He made, and that participation includes what we would call how people manage their public life together, their life beyond the family, that's political life. And so if that's what people are doing, then how are we thinking about um, toward what should we aspire? What are the to what how much are we thinking about what politics can actually accomplish? How are we aware of the hazards there, because we are between Genesis 3 and Revelation 21? And what kind of experiment are we going to try to have? In other words, and theologically, even, how are we trying to theologize about that? Because to me, the important thing is, in fact, this is the bigger thing to me more than any label, that a person doesn't forget that they're a Christian wherever they go.
Mhm.
I think sometimes, two kingdoms people, well, there's all kinds of two kingdoms things, right? But some versions of two kingdoms suggest you're the worshiper in the church,
Mhm.
but you keep the worshiper in the church, or the
Mhm.
worshiper at church and home.
Mhm.
In other domains, you're a human
Mhm.
like other humans. You have opportunities and you want to do them, you want to do them well, but you don't want to churchify those other things. Great. But sometimes the way I think people might hear that, it means my goal is just to do a good job. It's not necessarily to think about how the fact that I'm Christian and I'm informed that loving your neighbor as yourself is really important. And there are things that are happening in terms of the world I inhabit where laws or whatever has made it clear that the neighbors are being antagonized. I that doesn't inform does that not inform how I'm going to think about what
Mhm.
politics might be able to do? I don't have to turn the world into a church to care about loving my neighbor.
Exactly. Yep.
And so I think
Non-Christians can do the same thing. They can love their
yes,
neighbor just as well
yes,
as any
yes,
Christian can.
yes, yes, yes. So I think that it's important to think about how do we speak about participating in the world Christianly. And also, by the way, knowing that we are limited people and limited in our perspective, how do we do that with humility rather than with um, triumphalism or hyper optimism? And the reason I think that this is important is because just look at world history. Show me where there's been this time when, because some Christian movement was in charge, everything just worked out spectacularly.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that I'm not saying Calvinism, even for example, was a terrible place. That's not what
Mhm.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm just saying whatever it was, first of all, he wasn't the only person there.
Uh-huh.
Everybody there wasn't the same kind of Christian he was.
Uh-huh.
And however things are working out, it's not everything, no matter how good it might have been. And of course, it's not where we are now.
Mhm.
So how am I aware of what's possible, but also what are the limitations? And how do I make sure that I'm not making too much of what this is? So I should participate, but I shouldn't have triumphalistic expectations.
Mhm.
And particularly because a lot of times what happens when people have these triumphalistic expectations? Well, sometimes nothing happens and people are really disappointed. Other times people get some control and then what do? Well, they make a mess. So I think it's important for people to be engaged, to not forget that they're Christians, to not try to turn things that aren't churches into churches, but also to think about what kind of penultimate goods can we put into place with our limited perspective, because there's a lot we don't understand, a lot we don't see. How we put those things into place and kind of keep working with and experimenting with the way that our faithfulness can be an aspect of what contributes to the common good, especially if you're in a pluralistic society. So we're in this context of opportunity that most people haven't had in world history, but it's also in the 21st century in a much more pluralistic environment. So how do you do that? How do you make sure that people see that you're seeking their good as much as yours, and that however you do that, you're creating space for certain kinds of disagreements, but you're also saying, well, let's see what we can work together on to try to begin to make things at least a little bit better. Because there's a lot of stuff, a lot of stuff's complicated, and we have to be honest about that.
Mhm.
Another long
Um,
answer to your
no,
question.
these are all great. This is another question stems from this, and maybe digging a little bit deeper and then going to a slightly different topic before conclusion. For and you just talked about this, but I want to pin it. Um, for Christians, non-Christians who I'll say look at the opposite spectrum. A Christian looks at a non-politically engaged Christian, or at least their
Uh-huh.
perspective is non-politically engaged,
Uh-huh.
and they see nothing getting done. All the laws
Yeah.
are going out of our favor. That
Yeah.
the government's going corrupt, at least according to their
Uh-huh.
perspective, and the church
Uh-huh.
is going corrupt. And so they no, we
Uh-huh.
need to push harder into this. We
Uh-huh.
need to make everything about this. And
Uh-huh.
then maybe the other side is they see that and it's like, well, we can't do anything in public. If that's what that looks like,
Uh-huh.
then we need to be not hermits, but our faith can't be anything in the public market because it
Yeah.
has to be pluralistic,
Uh-huh.
that our faith must be muted in some way, shape, or form.
Uh-huh.
Um, that it's so I see again, those are very, very
Uh-huh.
stark continuums, but they tend to be the loudest, at
Uh-huh.
least in the social media or public square or whatever it may be, or in politics.
Uh-huh.
Can you help both sides? I'll say those who are responding by being even more politically engaged,
Uh-huh.
and those who are responding by pulling back and meeting down their faith a little bit because we are a pluralistic society.
Uh-huh. I think the people that want to be overly optimistic, I want to say just be a realist. Even if it's all Christians, you think because they're Christians, they're all going to agree on what to do?
Mm-hmm.
We're limited people. Our limitations are part of what are going to lead to our disagreements because we don't see everything the same way. We don't tend to prioritize certain things the same way. And so we're not going to get some, mythic society.
What if they say, but Dr. Bakecoat, we're going to put the Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed as an addendum to the Constitution, and that's going to keep us at least somewhat united on the baseline ecumenical stuff that Christians have to agree on.
Um, just how much are the people in your denomination agree is what I would say.
Okay.
Seriously,
Yeah.
because having it there doesn't make it turn into some magic thing that then all of a sudden, everywhere around, the Christians just have this kind of effect based on it showing up, did it to the Constitution, that now everything is going to make us kumbaya in a way. I mean, I just want to know, I mean, how many church meetings have you been to that tell you that that's the way it's going to work out just because
Yeah.
people have the same thing? So it's just not going to work that way. I also think, well, first of all, it's never going to happen that you can add that because there's just not enough of a consensus among Christians, much less among all the people in the United States for that to happen. But I do think that the point is that you don't have to be a triumphalist to make a contribution. And I think one of the things we have to do is we have to be willing to have an imagination about what can Christian contributions look like now in a society that is more pluralistic than it was even 20 years ago, but a society where still, even with all the stuff about the nuns and everything, there's still this at least lip service to basic Christian ideas. I think there's still the opportunity to help people to understand that to say that a Christian wants to be involved is not to say that a Christian wants to take over. Some Christians do want to take over, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But this is not most Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I'm particularly thinking about the people that aren't Christians to help them to understand that, well, if you ask me what I think it means or why it's important for me as a Christian for my faith to show up with me, is because it's my faith that really makes me care about you. Really makes me wonder how things are going in your neighborhood, in the families in your neighborhood. Inclines me to ask about questions that I might not otherwise ask. Makes me wonder about, well, what about the people I'm not aware of? And how can I begin to at least have my antenna up about the people I'm not aware of so that I am inclined to be a person that can learn about what's challenging the lives of other people when things aren't basically within my wavelength, so to speak. Am I thinking about those people? Well, it's my that baseline commitment of neighbor love that's orienting me to do that. Jesus sort of, I think, makes very clear in the second grace in the parable of the Good Samaritan that every neighbor is what? Every other human being, not just the human beings you like, not just your group. It's everybody that's an image bearer. And so, if I'm thinking about everybody that's an image bearer, then how am I trying to seek their flourishing? And so that has to do with the way I think about justice. That has to do with the way I think about being creative and introducing things in terms of making the world better. But how do I do that? Also aware of my limitations, and that even if I have the most brilliant people, guess what? Even those people, as brilliant as they are, as many bases as they've covered, they too have limitations. There's things they don't know, and there's things that they don't know that they don't recognize that they don't know. And they too are frail. They too go the way of all flesh. I mean, so all of these things tell you that we should not heap realized eschatological expectations on what Christians are going to do in terms of their public engagements and commitments. I think our eschatology, at the very least, can orient us to say, hey, a new world is coming. Maybe we can think about what might be a glimpse, a coming attraction type of thing. That's about all we're going to get. And hopefully we want it to be good trailers, not like the trailers that you thought were okay. And then you
Yeah,
went and
you want
saw
a
the
good sneak
movie.
peek.
Yeah, exactly. Then you go see the movie. You go, I don't know how that trailer had anything to do with this film. But so but you want to be able to maybe try to have those kinds of glimpses. To the people that are saying it's hopeless, I want to say that's the opportunity to be creative, to help people to understand that Christian participation in a context of difficulty is, first of all, quite biblical, since throughout the New Testament, you can't escape all this language about opposition. Mm-hmm. No Christian should be surprised by that. The agency that we have in a country like the United States means that, guess what? Chances are, whatever opposition you have, it's not going to be anything like what Christians were experiencing in the first 3 centuries of the church. So, that again doesn't mean that people can't harm you, do bad things, lie about you. They will, but it's not going to be as bad as it was in some of those places, and as bad as it is in some places around the world now, where people's lives are actually in danger if they're Christians. So, however we think about opposition, again, because you're a citizen of a country like the United States, there are ways that you can begin to show people that, hey, what actually is making me inclined to participate is not some fantastical realized eschatological dream. It's simply that politics is one of the ways I can love my neighbors. And I realize that my neighbors aren't all like me, so I have to think about what are ways I help them to see that I care about their families. I care about their health care. I care about how long it takes infrastructure to be repaired in their neighborhoods, all those types of things. I care about that. And why? Because you're a human being and God tells me that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And it's not just about me. It's about us. And I mean about us in some kind of, don't people shouldn't be thinking when they hear me say that, oh, what, is he some kind of hippie or something talking about us and we? Or is he a communist talking about us and we? So no, it's just the fact that there are other people in the world besides me as a human being. And so the body politic, okay, we're in a world with other people. And so what about us in this world? And how do Christians care about us in this world, not just themselves in this world? And so I think to have a participation where you're trying to have an inclination toward as best as you can, seeking the public good. Um, it doesn't have to mean that Christians make themselves ugly and indigestible to um, to people that are non-Christians. I think sometimes people think to be a Christian means that you've got to be as loud and zealous and offensive as possible. Let the gospel offend. Let your life be the aroma of the gospel, which because you're doing it, if people are like, I don't get you, or maybe they might get mad, but they're not getting mad because you're actively doing things to antagonize them. Instead, what you're trying to do things is to show how neighborly you are. And if you're trying to do that, then it's just helping people to see that there are other ways than the rumors you've heard. And I want you to see some of these other ways.
That's a very helpful answer. Now, again, two groups, kind of the same groups I just said, with slight deviations.
Mm-hmm.
If you can speak to them, some concluding questions, and then final thoughts from you, whatever you want to say. Can you talk to the ascending Christian nationalists or theonomists who are like, oh man, we're rising in power, rising in influence, like we're going to get this thing done, we're going to take over the government, we're going to do, or they think that they're doing this, or like this is the way, like Christians are finally getting power back again, that we're gonna run this thing. And you're telling them, I was like, hey guys, let's temper down our stuff. And they're like, they're saying back to you, is like, Dr. Bako, like, why are you raining our parade? Like, why are you telling us we can't do all this? That this seems like a defeatist mentality. If you can talk to the first group, Christian nationalists, like why is that not defeatist? And actually, no, this is a better way forward.
Well, first of all, if you're in the United States of America, whatever you're thinking about, please be aware of the fact that the Bible says nothing about this country. That's the first thing.
Exactly.
There's nothing about anything this side of the Atlantic. So whatever you're thinking, first of all, don't confuse whatever is happening here with being the center of salvation history. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is I think it's great that people want to have influence in society. But again, as I said earlier, are you thinking that just because you're Christian and you have an idea about this, that you are actually confident to do this? I mean, in other words, what makes you confident that if you get let's say you get all your people in office, first of all, are they going to get along? Second, do they know how to work the machinery? Third, do they know how to deal with the temptations of power and influence? And are there people to help them to be aware of those temptations of power and influence? Because there's too many people that, they get in those situations and it's like heroin for them. Heroin, crack, fentanyl, pick your drug of choice. They're bad. So if no one's helping you do that, then what's going to happen? Well, somebody's probably going to disappoint you. And just think about this. Even the best, mayor, governor, senator, state representative, president, etc., no matter who they always disappoint somebody. And then I guess the other thing I would say is that it's important to understand that political possibilities that we have, and again, they're unique ones that we have in the United States, those political possibilities are not an excuse to confuse your political identity with your central Christian identity. Because the Bible isn't thinking about our contemporary political parties. The Bible's thinking about what? People that belong to God, people around the whole world, not just people in this geography. And that has to be fundamentally more primary than anything else. And so when you talk about, okay, when were those people in this place? The thing I want to say to the rising theonomist Christian nationalists is, I'll pose a question. What for you convinces you that this is the solution? And if you talk about getting something back, what exactly are you getting back? And what time period in the United States are you thinking about?
Hmm.
when this happened because we've never been that ideal of a place. It's like when people say, I think the United post World War II 1950s is kind of what it was. Well, I'm African American, okay, and so Jim
It
Crow was
wasn't
still
good.
going on.
Yeah,
Second, the children that went wild in the 60s were being raised in the 50s. So whatever was
true.
going on in some of those places, the homes with the nice picket fences were a veneer where at some point the kids called BS on it because they said, you go to church, you don't even believe this. You're also having the beginning of the kind of corporate man. Dad's never home because dad's always at work. Your family's starting to have these problems. You're not just having some ideal, leave it to Beaver, father knows best. Uh, for listeners who have no idea what those things are, vintage, you can look it up on vintage television. But you have this idea of these families in the suburbs in a nice neighborhood that are interestingly typically monochromatic neighborhoods, and somehow this is ideal because who's not in those neighborhoods? Who's not enjoying that life?
Mhm.
Is that what you want to go back to? Because then what you want to go back to is a world that's good for you, but not good for all people that are citizens of this country. So I think that's an important question to ask. And then, of course, maybe the bigger question is, what are you afraid of? What do you think that you are losing? It's certainly the case that look, we are in a truly postmodern moment, okay, all over the place, and we're in a world where identity is malleable. You can claim that it's what was given to you one day and is what you make the next. We're in a society where I think some more progressive political causes are making the various people proxies for their own activism. Um, we definitely have certain kinds of secularizing. I mean, not in the dreams of that people were having in the 60s and 70s that some kind of reign of science was going to give us a kind of public square where science gives us all the answers and religion's in the closet, and we're in a nice, rational, scientific world. No, we're in a much more of a free for all kind of space. And then on top of that, you've got just all the stress that people are having because of the ways that people's lives are more disintegrated. Point being is that there are real problems, but is the answer to those real problems inhabiting a mythology that will not get accomplished in this country, which is that somehow Christians are going to take over everything? Catholic integralists are not going to take over. Okay, a small group of Presbyterians are not going to take over. A small group of Lutherans aren't going to take over. A small group of Baptists aren't going to take over. And so you may have people here and there that are involved, but all I would say is you do maybe have a few of them that are in Congress now. Just show me what they're doing that's actually leading to the flourishing of communities, as opposed to building a brand based on some kind of personality that they have. And I think I would just encourage honest assessment about that, honest self-reflection about that. And I guess just go back to one more thing. If
Mhm.
people are thinking about what they want to gain, if you're getting what you want, who is in that world? And who is flourishing in that world? Who is prominent in that world? When you close your eyes and imagine the neighborhoods, who's there? Who's not there? Right. And because you're in a world that God has made, um, how are you seeking the good of all in that imagination? So those are among the things I would bring up.
Those are great. Now, if you can, last group and then final thoughts.
Yeah.
If you can speak to I'll call them the decriers of Christian nationalism or theonomy. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
those,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
ones who just like cry at whatever they say, but then
Mhm.
do it so much they don't actually do any good in society that
Yeah.
they're like,
Yeah.
they're doing all the wrong stuff, but like, we don't
Mhm.
really have a better option. So we're just going to
Yeah.
tell them that they're wrong.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that the data shows that actual rabid Christian nationalists is not that big a number of people. There are a lot of people that, I mean, of all kinds, people who would never know what Christian nationalist is.
Yeah.
If you ask them, uh, is in some way the United States some kind of Christian nation, they would say yes.
Yeah.
But they mean something very different than the United States being a nation that God appointed. George Washington's Moses, and there's a new covenant, all that kind of stuff. That's very imaginative for sure, but it's a lie. Uh, but um, the so I would say first of all, what percentage of people are actually really that way? Now, the point is that it's depending upon where you are, depending upon the circles you inhabit, you may encounter some people whose way of thinking about the United States has some version of an idea that the United States is a uniquely Christian nation, which I think is very interesting if you think about how, okay, well, what about these European nations post Reformation that, or I guess the medieval ones as well, if you're going to go with those, if you include the Catholics, that are clearly these religious nations.
Mm-hmm.
What are you saying about them? Anyway, my point being that I think it's important to get people to ask about what narratives they're believing about the United States. But at some point, you got to do more than just point that out. And so, what I would say is, one, if you're pointing it out, are you pointing it out like you pointed out to somebody that you love, not someone for whom you have contempt or disdain? And I think whatever groups of people we're talking about, one of the temptations of our era is an intensified um, environment that almost says it's a virtue to have disdain for people that are not your people. And the problem is, if you're a Christian, that is not something that is for you, because you are to love your neighbors. You love your enemies. People that might say, you are my enemy, but you love them. So, are you responding to these people that exasperate you in a way where you're saying, I share what I'm sharing, but I'm sharing it really as lament, because I think it's not good for the person or good for a Christian witness for people to have a kind of Christian nationalist disposition. But then also I would say is then think about how are we encouraging people to a long-term vision about politics that is thinking about, okay, how are we in small ways at least trying to imagine ways to facilitate the common good, and are we trying to help people to do that by helping people to remember that, hey, no matter what's going on with national elections, etc., citizens of the United States can always remember that moniker: politics is local. All
Mm-hmm.
politics is local. And so, are there local things you can look at? Are there local things with education, with public works? Somebody need a playground. You need to improve the playground. Whatever it is. Are there things to which you can direct your attention, where you can actually avail yourself of your agency and think about how can I, in some small way, contribute to things being a little bit better around here, even if I can't imagine having any influence beyond around here. So I think that is another thing that could be helpful for people.
Awesome. Now, any final thoughts? The floor is open for anything Vincent Baycoat wants to let the listening audience know. Floor is open.
I just want to encourage people to remember their fundamental beliefs, and remember their fundamental beliefs, to remember that, one, God's in charge of history. And if God's in charge of history, we should never be fearful people. that if you are living in a context like the United States, there's some version of public faithfulness that you can have. That's probably a greater possibility than people have been able to have in world history. You know, seek God and find out maybe what some ways maybe you can do that. For some people, that may be voting for the first time. For other people, that may mean sending an email to the mayor or something. And for other people, it might be all the way to running for office. But I also want people to be aware of the fact that politics is part of the things that we participate in our cultural formation. It is not the only thing. We also have to be wary of people that will suggest to us that your political identity is most prominent, because then what's happening is you turn your politics into an idol. You are basically asking God to sponsor the political identity rather than asking God to interrogate the political identity. And so I think it's really important to remember what our fundamental beliefs are. And our fundamental beliefs ought to, you know, keep God central, love your neighbor with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It means you can't love anything else as much as him. If you're giving that God that kind of love, you cannot give politics that kind of love. And so to remember that, but then also love your neighbor as yourself. How am I thinking about seeking the good for everybody? How do I learn maybe to pray better for the people that make me want to scream? Because there's probably maybe one person at some point in your life has made you want to scream.
Mm-hmm.
How do you pray for that person rather than just for God? Would you send lightning on that person? Instead of praying for that, how do you pray for the flourishing of that person? Maybe for the healing of that person's pain and distress or being misguided. How do you learn to do that? I really want to encourage that. And then how do we think about seizing the opportunity of a moment when there's all kinds of confusion to be people who show that we're very hopeful, not because all the circumstances are working out, but because we know the end of the story. Mm-hmm. And that even when we're in distress, we kind of have a little smirk on our face that says, man, it's rough, but I can't walk around with the grimace because I keep remembering how it's all going to end. And it's great how it's going to end. And so I've got inside information. And so how am I going to live like I've got that inside information?